Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. Our ongoing study in the complete works of Plato, translated by Jowett. We're going to take a look at the Protagoras. It's going to be pages 309 to 320, and it's the first part. It's the introduction to the Protagoras, and then we'll have two lessons on the original document. But this is the introduction. 309 to 320. Very brief introduction, but we know that the introductions are important. They help us to focus when we take up the original document in the following two lessons. Let's go to block 1 and take a look at the introduction. This dialogue is on the science and the knowledge of human life. It's a discussion of the political virtues, and it asks the question, can virtue be taught as a duty of citizens? Now, the political virtues are all a possession shared by everyone, and are they simple or are they diverse and many? And the proposed starting point is to become good is difficult. They begin with that statement, Socrates and Protagoras. The dialogue begins, are the virtues one or many? Are they not all abbreviated under the good? And does not knowledge govern the human life? Therefore, are we not positing that virtue can be taught? That's the premise for the dialogue between Socrates and Protagoras. Can virtue be taught? Is it teachable? Or is it more than that? And specifically, what we are being asked in this dialogue is virtue, divine virtue, isn't it really beyond concept? That's really what Plato wants us to think about, isn't virtue something, especially divine virtue, isn't it something really beyond concept? We can think back to our studies of Hegel. And Hegel realized that once you reach absolute spirit and conceptual understanding, there's that moment of counterblow where you have to retreat back into aesthetics, because absolute spirit technically is beyond concept. And the truth being sought here in the Protagoras is the fact that virtue, as a divine gift, as a divine virtue, must be understood as that which is beyond concept. So that is the foundation for the dialogue. Now, block 2, the methodology employed. Synthesize the transcendental and the sensate. Protagoras is the sophist rhetoric. Socrates is the philosophical transcendental thought. And we're looking for a unity of ideas that must be reached. And it's poetry versus philosophy, aesthetics versus conceptual knowledge. Protagoras represents the poets. Socrates represents rational philosophy. A unity of virtue is sought, a unity between virtue and knowledge. How will they reconcile the two passages in the Simonides? How will they reconcile the two passages? That's the task. The dialogue becomes a satire on interpretation. Allies are formed, the players, Socrates and Alcibiades represent philosophical knowledge. Protagoras and Callias represent aesthetic virtue, and Critias is neutral. So what we need to understand is basically block 3, because we get a very good 5-point summary at the end of this introduction. And it tells us what we're facing. And basically we are facing a dialogue that addresses the issue that virtue, divine higher virtue, is something that is beyond concept. It involves concept, but it must include that return into aesthetics as well. So the 5-point summary of the dialogue: we transition from conventional morality to conceptual morality. The key paradox: virtue can and cannot be taught. Virtue can be taught, but virtue also cannot be taught. Virtue must be drawn out of the self. The second paradox: virtue is the knowledge of both pleasure and pain. The eventual conclusion: virtue is knowledge. But it's a knowledge that is beyond concept. You can teach it because it is concept. You cannot teach it because it is beyond concept. And that's the tension that we will exist within as we go through the original document. The tension of virtue is something conceptual. We can form a concept of justice. We can form a concept of wisdom. We can form a concept of the good. But virtue is also beyond those concepts, in the realm of the divine. Virtue is something that technically we can only speak of in an aesthetic, poetic way. We can speak of it poetically. When we speak of it conceptually, something is lacking, because true spiritual higher virtue is beyond all conceptual expression. It's something that is received as a gift from the gods. It's a gift from God. And as a gift from God, it is not explainable merely in concepts. We must include aesthetics and conceptual knowledge together. So I think it's an excellent introduction to give us a way to kind of come to grips with what we're going to face in this dialogue, which I've looked at some other critiques, and everyone admits, I've looked at some critiques online, and they all admit it's a difficult dialogue because it isn't clear-cut, systematic. It is aesthetic at times, it is conceptual at times. It goes back and forth dialectically between aesthetics and concept. So just to hit it one more time, Block 3, the 5-point summary of the dialogue. We transition from conventional morality to conceptual morality. And the key paradox is that virtue can and cannot be taught. It can be taught as concept, it cannot be taught as a higher divine virtue, as a gift. Virtue must be drawn out of the self. The second paradox: virtue is the knowledge of both pleasure and pain. And the eventual conclusion: virtue is knowledge. But it's a knowledge beyond concept. It's knowledge as a gift. It's knowledge as a gift. It is knowledge beyond concept. So, the 5-point summary. We will look at a morality beyond conceptual morality. We will address a study as a paradox, that virtue can be taught as concept, and virtue cannot be taught because it is beyond concept, because it has to rely on aesthetics as well, poetry as well. It has to be drawn out of the self, because we do discuss the axiom that the self is the measure of virtue. But how do we interpret that? How is self the measure of virtue? Well, dialectically, the self is the measure of virtue. The self is gifted with that which is beyond concept, but then the self is to work through that gift and refine that gift. So it is a dialectical refinement of virtue being drawn out of the self. And it's a knowledge that pleasure and pain both are apparent under this category of political virtue. But how is it related to knowledge? That's the key. And it's related to knowledge as gift beyond concept and as concept. Virtue is gift beyond concept, and virtue is concept. It is both conceptually articulated, and it is beyond any conceptual articulation and must rely on the poetry of aesthetics. That's going to wrap up the introduction to the Protagoras, pages 309 to 320. The first half of the original document will be next. That's going to be pages 320 to 344. Next, we'll take a look at 320 to 344, first half of the original document of the Protagoras.